Several things are worth noting here about this passage. The first one is that the mission discourse of Jesus is prompted by his seeing the crowds helpless and harassed, like sheep without a shepherd. This is a very important passage because it's an allusion to imagery that you'll find in several of the prophets in the Old Testament. Ezekiel is one that comes to mind that describes the people of Israel like a flock of sheep who are supposed to be being led by their shepherds, but who are in fact being abused by their shepherds, fleeced by their shepherds in the sense that their money is being taken from them, their stuff is being stolen from them, and they are not being led to God precisely by the people who are supposed to lead them to God in the Old Testament, namely the priests in the temple. So it's interesting that Jesus here sees the people in need of leadership, and of course he himself will say elsewhere, he'll speak of himself as a shepherd, like later in the gospel he'll say, "Strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered," in the Garden of Gethsemane. In the Gospel of John he'll say, "I am the good shepherd." But in this case, Jesus appoints the 12 in response to this need for leadership amongst the people of Israel that he sees and compares to a flock of sheep in need of a shepherd. So that's the first thing to highlight here, is that the apostolic ministry and the apostolic mission flows from Jesus's recognition that the people are going to need leadership. So to this day, at the risk of getting ahead of myself, I'll just point this out, that the bishops in the Catholic Church, who are the successors of the apostle, will often have the bishop's crook, the bishop's staff, which is the symbolic of their identity as a shepherd. And it doesn't mean that Jesus isn't the shepherd. You can't ask the question, who's the shepherd of the church? Is it the bishops or is it Christ? Well, the answer is both. They are shepherds who are sent by the one shepherd, the supreme shepherd, who is, of course, Christ himself. So that's the first imagery point there. The second image is this image of the harvest being plentiful, but the laborers being few. So here the image shifts. Now it's not a flock of sheep in need of shepherds, it's a harvest in need of laborers, in need of harvesters, in need of reapers to go out and harvest the fruits of the field, harvest the grain of the wheat. And so in that context, the need for the harvest take place. Jesus calls the 12 to him, and he sets them apart from his other followers and gives them authority. The Greek word here is exousia, and it can also be translated as power. It's the same word that is used to describe Jesus' teaching earlier in the Gospel of Matthew at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, when the people say, he taught as one having authority, or he taught with power. There was a power in his words, an authority in his words. Well, the very authority that Jesus himself possesses when he speaks the Sermon on the Mount, he then gives to Matthew and Thomas and Andrew and James and John and Judas, the 12 who are chosen to be his emissaries, chosen to act as shepherds on behalf of him as the messianic shepherd of God in leading the people into the kingdom of God. So the 12 apostles are not just Jesus's closest friends. They're not just the followers that were particularly intimate with him and close to him amongst the multitudes. No. He gives them exousia. They have a share in his own authority. And it's through that exousia, through that authority, that they are able not just to proclaim the kingdom of God, but to shepherd people into it, to go out and harvest, so to speak, to participate in the harvest of souls that Jesus is calling for with the coming of the kingdom. So this is the first commissioning of the 12, and we could go into all kinds of interesting studies of each of these figures of the 12 apostles. For our purposes here, I would just want to highlight something about the list that's peculiar to the list of the apostles in the New Testament. Every time you'll get a list of the apostles' names in the Gospels, there are a couple of variations between the names between Gospels. Because as we've seen elsewhere, Jews often have more than one name, so that's not a big deal. But the point that's interesting is Simon Peter is always listed first, and Judas Iscariot is always listed last. So there's a hierarchy within the list itself that points to Peter's role as the chief representative of the 12, and effectively the leader of the 12 apostles. And of course it points to Judas's role, his ignominious role as the traitor among the 12, who will eventually be replaced by Matthias in the book of Acts in order to reconfigure the number, or to fill the number of the 12, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, which is the next point I want to make. Why 12? Well, if you know anything about the Old Testament, you know that there are 12 sons of Jacob and 12 tribes of Israel in the book of Exodus at the time of Moses. The number 12 is the constitutive number for the people of Israel. When you see the number 12, think 12 tribes of Israel. Think people of Israel. So when Jesus chooses the 12 to be his 12 students and gives them authority, in a first-century Jewish context, this is very important. It would imply that Jesus isn't just the long-awaited Messiah or the long-awaited King of Israel. It also implies that Jesus is constituting around himself a new Israel with new tribal leaders, new patriarchs, whose exousia, whose authority, is not going to flow from their blood lineage with relationship to Jacob. Are you descended from one of the sons of Jacob? But rather will flow from their relationship to Jesus, who has now given them an exousia that is independent of their genealogy. Sometimes I'll have students say, Dr. Petrie, have you ever looked into whether each of the 12 apostles is descended from one of the 12 tribes? So there's like a bloodline descent. I understand the inclination. It would be really cool if each apostle was from one of the 12 tribes of Israel. But I actually think the fact that they're not, because there are several pairs of brothers, or at least a couple pairs of brothers, Peter and Andrew being the obvious example, there's no indication that they're descended from each of the 12 tribes. And that actually might be the point, to show that in the new Israel that Jesus is constituting around himself, what's going to matter is not the blood of Jacob, but the blood of Christ. Because it's going to be the same 12 who later in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus gathers around himself and gives his blood under the appearance of wine and his body under the appearance of bread, and will say to them, you 12 will sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So they are connected to the 12 tribes, but it's not genealogically at the Old Testament, it's eschatologically through the New Covenant. So again, something to think about. The church isn't just an institution, it is the new people of Israel, it's the new constitution, so to speak, of Israel around Christ. And the 12 are at the head of it, they're the font of it, they're the shape of it, just like the 12 sons of Jacob were the constitutive body for the people of Israel.